in terms of increasing revenues and increasing their own earnings as a group. The PSE listed companies as a group last year increased their revenue streams by something like about close to 20% over the previous year, and earnings about 18.5% to 19% over the previous year. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, this is the single largest increase when you compare ourselves to ASEAN. No other group of publicly listed companies grew revenues and earnings by that much. So clearly what's driving interest in the stock market and publicly listed companies is the fact that the underlying companies have been able to generate such spectacular growth, even faster than the economy itself.
Thank you. Very encouraging. I see a question.
My name is Shane Burt. I'm with UTI Global Logistics, American Stock Exchange listed company. Two questions. First question is, the Philippine government has a fairly stringent anti-investment law or local protectionism laws with regards to foreigners coming in and operating businesses here as a private sector in the Philippines. If those businesses are then converted to stock exchange companies, in other words, we actually invest here and we list ourselves on the stock exchange here, do the anti-investment laws still apply or do they not apply? That's question number one. Question number two is, your graph on growth taking inflation into consideration, the actual growth rate is only sort of 1.5% to 2% after inflation. Do you see that as far as investment perspective goes, do you see that as improving over time, or do you see that growth staying as a 1 to 2 percentage points above inflation over the longer period of time? Thank you.
Two very interesting and I guess tough questions, but I'll tackle the first one on foreign ownership limits. As you know, there is a constitutional provision saying that, at least for some sectors, that some, industries, cannot be owned by foreigners, or in some cases cannot have an ownership, percentage higher than 40% for foreigners. Now, there's actually a particular case that's being discussed right now, given the Supreme Court decision on PLDT. But we have been working with the SEC and with the Cabinet. It is actually quite important. So that foreign ownership limit, the question of most firms or most investors are, will these limits stand for current industries as we know it and the definition of capital? So actually there's maybe an overlying additional principle. And I think the answer is that we are trying to work with the SEC, and I think the SEC is quite receptive, in terms of saying that the definition of capital should be perhaps closer to what's been used over the last 75 years, as opposed to what I guess was put down for this particular Supreme Court decision regarding PLDT. Now, we are awaiting those rules. They will come out, I think, by the end of March. But I think the news for everyone is that it's not going to be interpreted, I think, in the strictest sense of the word, as what some commentators were speculating when it came out in October, November of last year. That's point number one. Point number two, you may have seen the news wherein the economic team of the Cabinet have also been meeting and trying to define which industries should be taken out of maybe the restricted list, or to loosen up that definition. Again, knowing that capital is quite scarce in this part of the world, despite the fact that today we do have a relative boom in the local market. So I think that what that means is that for many other industries, hopefully as we move forward, that there will be more industries that have perhaps a larger potential foreign stake as opposed to the current series that's under that list. Now, to answer the question on growth rates and maybe the delta or the difference between current growth rates, real growth rates, and maybe inflation, I'd like to note that the Philippines historically has been operating perhaps under a flat scenario, i.e., there has been no, in other words, that growth was maybe equal to inflation. So it's probably over only the last few years where we've seen now real growth exceeding the inflation rate. So I think that's good news, number one. Number two, is that sustainable? We think so, given the fact that some of the underlying fundamentals, and hopefully I guess, number 3, we hope that that increase between a growth rate that's higher and an inflation rate that's lower actually starts persisting. Now, again, recent trends, and it's a I guess a daily debate that we face when we talk about consumer price indices, and with gasoline or oil prices now spiking, affecting the CPI. So I guess we're going to have a relative bump this month when we take a look at the indicators. But I do think that the fundamentals hopefully will carry us through. And certainly for 2013 and even to 2014, the fundamentals are looking good from where we sit or stand. Sorry, long answer.
Very good answer. Questions?
This is my question. So, if I'm not mistaken, you said that the mining sector is the best performing sector in the Philippine Stock Exchange. And at the same time, the capital raised by the mining sector went down compared to last year. So, my questions are, first, what makes the mining sectors perform well relative to other sector? And secondly, is the fact that the mining sector, or the statement that the mining sector is the best performing sector, contradicts with the statement that the capital raise in the mining sector declined compared to last year. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. It's, I guess the chart which I had shown earlier basically looked at a trend line, I think from 2009. Actually, let me see if I can bring that up. There we go. Yes, from 2009. So what this tells you is the index, it's based on the price performance of stocks in the various sectors. And clearly what this shows, it's the mining and oil sector, of course, outperforming the rest of the index and all the other subsectors. So I think that's now the statement that you didn't have enough fundraising on the sector last year is also correct. And I would say that actually last year, in fact, the only sector that did not perform, that was not, in fact, it was down, was actually the mining sector. Now, so in 2012, the mining sector was down as a group, mainly because of, I suspect it's this EO79 overhang, if I might call it that. And certainly that uncertainty also led to less fundraising in the sector. Now, price performance in terms of stocks also probably indicate that with not enough activity and maybe the scare of some of the issues relating to what the anti-mining lobby has been so successfully putting out in the press, has pushed back maybe interest in the sector from investors in general. So that's, I guess, the technical reason for why stocks did not do too well last year. And I think the sector could perform much better once we have clarity on both EO79 as well as perhaps better engagement with those who are in the anti-mining lobby.
Thank you. Any questions? Any more?
Some years ago, when I was ambassador to Australia, we worked very hard to get the PMRC established. I see that you have been adopting it, and I'm just curious how far it has improved the listing of mining companies. Has it really helped? I would like to be able to say that when we're having another roundtable meetings in Australia very soon, to see how much it has meant to the industry. I'm curious to see that you did not put one of the challenges, the fact that the anti-mining sentiment is quite a strong, has also made a strong impact, I think, on the way people see investments in the Philippines. Is it because it does not really affect the real investors, or is it just, you think, a a media impact? What do you think from your point of view? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Albert. Well, I think first of all, on the implementation of the PMRC, it's a net positive for us at the stock exchange because it has improved the corporate governance and transparency reporting for mining companies. So that may not have arguably an immediate economic effect, but we do feel, which is very much in line with our corporate governance standard, let's call it improvement program, that those companies which promote strong transparency, strong corporate governance, not just mining companies, but other companies, actually get a higher boost in terms of what we call relative returns. And I'll give you an example. In Brazil did this experiment about, 12, 13 years ago. And they actually established something called the Novo Mercado, which is, and I guess our friends from Valle can confirm this. Novo Mercado was a good governance board wherein they put out higher standards of corporate governance and disclosure. And then if you track basically the stock performance of companies under the Novo Mercado versus the regular index, the, I guess, Bovespa's index, what's been proven empirically is that the valuation of companies under this good governance board was actually a lot higher under same circumstances than the regular index. So what it does say is that there is a premium, I guess, over time that investors pay for good corporate governance, which includes, of course, increased transparency. And that's where I think PMRC comes in. Now, we haven't been able to measure that as a specific item, and maybe we should actually. In fact, now talking about the challenges and relating it to this particular point, I would argue that the challenge for the mining sector here is actually having enough, what do you call it, competent persons to actually assist mining companies as they get qualified, as PMRC, under the PMRC guidelines, to basically reflect that for the exchange's purposes. Because clearly we're not in the business of mining. We're in the business of actually listing companies and trying to have a fair marketplace. So this is perhaps one of the technical constraints that we face. It's interesting that we did not say the publicity issue regarding anti-mining. And now that you ask it, I'm not sure what the exact answer is, and I think we should review whether that's really had a negative impact. But I think in the short run, it has had a negative impact in terms of mining activity. Certainly, if you're a financial investor looking at the Philippines and looking at the mining sector in particular relative to, say, the banking sector, the real estate sector, or the consumer goods sector, any negative issue that seems prevalent, i.e., being brought out by the anti-mining guys, would probably mean that you would shift your portfolio and say, let me look at branded consumer. That seems to be easier. Nobody complains about that sector too much, or maybe the real estate sector. So that will have an effect in terms of relative allocation. Again, that's a technical answer, but maybe not the one you're looking for. But we will study that question a little bit better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. There's room for one more question. Yes, Mr. Boswell.
Hi, Hans. Jeff Boswell, MRL Gold. I've got one point and one question. My point is that mixing mining and oil is a little bit difficult to measure performance. The sectors are so different in terms of the actual capital involved and the investor sentiment, I think, that they don't go well together. I suspect that the mining line is somewhat lost in the overall trend there. And my question is, you mentioned in passing that there's been some work to change the listing rules for mining companies. And this is really supplementary to Ambassador Delia's question. In talking to Australians, for instance, it's always been very difficult, if not impossible, to list an exploration company in the Philippines. I went through this in 2009 with a company that was trying to be listed. They really couldn't list unless they had a resource to report. Mining is a small part of our business overall. Yes, it's the sharp end where we make all the money, but most of the investment is gained and is sought for exploration. And not being able to not being able to list an exploration company in the Philippines, it may mean that the Philippine Stock Exchange is missing out on a lot of business that it could do otherwise. How has that changed, and how does that white paper help with listing a purely exploration company?
No, thanks for that question. We're quite aware of, I guess, of that limitation, and it's always, by the way, an exchange is always a balance of trying to, on one level, have investor protection as well as capital raising, and of course, trying to fit into the regulatory concerns of a particular sector. So in this case, mining represents, I guess, one of those sectors where you have literally the multitude of interests perhaps competing. From our point of view, clearly we would rather have more companies listed on the exchange, and to the extent that I guess exploration companies think that we need to make further adjustments in terms of our current rules, we welcome that dialogue. In fact, we actually rely on the industry to kind of tell us where exactly we need to improve. So again, it's not so much us trying to just draft rules and do things. The way we're trying to operate these days is to have a more inclusive type of dialogue. So I would say that to the extent that there's maybe an appreciation of what else needs to be done, we'd be happy to take that on board. And of course, clearly we need to then explain it to our own regulator, the SEC. And unfortunately, things are not as simple as us turning on various things, and which we've learned, or at least I've learned, I guess, over the last 2 years in this particular role. So we welcome that. I guess the first step that we tried to do on the exchange was simply to take away the 3-year, in this case, the 3-year operating history for an exploration company. But coupled with that is to say that there's actually some certification that there's already a resource or maybe a technology that's behind it. And since we're not the ones actually certifying it, we were looking to the, I guess, the Department of Energy as a partner to do that for us. So here is where perhaps the other constraint lies, is that maybe either the availability or the willingness of the DOE to help us on that front, although we signed an MOA with them to try and focus on this. And I guess secondly, this issue of competent persons. One of the things that I do recall even from my investment banking days is that there always seems to be a lack of competent persons here. Now, is that an issue that's being driven by the Association of Competent Persons? I'm not sure. But I would encourage them to actually increase their number or qualify more people so that you don't actually run into that constraint. Okay.
Thank you very much. I know there are a lot of burning questions out there, but Hans, thank you very much. You know, obviously, you have been one of the most questioned speakers that we've had historically, and I think that underscores the fact that what's going on at the PSE and what you're talking about is really very relevant to and very interesting for the business community, particularly this group of miners. I think, having heard what the performance has been of the PSE, I'd venture to say, and I mean this in a very good way, that it's probably the PSE has become the best mining company in town. And again, say this in a very well-meaning way, is we should mine the stock market. I mean, I don't mean that in the negative, okay? We know what that means in the mining industry, but as people with wallets and that need to be filled up, I think this is really a very good source of revenue if you do it right. And I think the PSE has really provided that opportunity for the investors in the Philippines. So on that note, I'd like to invite all of you to please put your hands together to show our appreciation to Hans.